Okay, wonderful. So, good evening to everybody. I'm Judge Kudz. I'll be your chair for this current finals round. Before we begin, congratulations to each and everyone who made it thus far and everyone who also participated in this tournament. Now we open the grand finals. Before we begin, we'll do an introduction for the wonderful set of panelists, and then we'll do a quick few reminders. So, for the introductions, we'll just go by the order that they show up on the tabs. So we'll start with Cap Ben.
Yo, Ben, good luck.
I think I'll go first. Hello, everyone. I'm Jamsed Gampong. Congratulations for making this far and good luck to the round.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Rhyzel, one of the panelists. Wishing everyone good luck.
All right, thank you. Wonderful. So now, just a quick few reminders. Please respect everyone's preferred pronouns and attributes. And secondly, respect everyone's preferred POI time. POIs are not mandatory, but still highly encouraged for a much more engaging round. So now, debating on the motion. The first motion, this House regrets the dominance of intersectionality in progressive discourse. In order to open this round, calling on the Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay. POIs to voice if you have any, just unmute before 6. I'll just set up my timer. But before anything, I'm so sorry. I'm cheesy. I'll do shout out. Shout out to ADS. Shout out to my teammates. I love them so much, especially C and Angela. Shout out to Hugh Mejos. I have not seen you in years. And most importantly, shout out to Pio who reminded me that I had this tournament this weekend. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. The dominance of intersectionality is holding back entrance of new members into progressive discourse and overtly exhausts resources critical mass from gaining things like meaningful discussions of those who are already part of this discourse in the first place. So let's be very clear. What does it actually mean when we talk about intersectionality? There are hierarchies within identities and there are intersections that exist within the specific combinations. We want to talk about those who are in the minorities of minorities. We want to talk about how these intersections exist and how do we cater to the intersections within these identities. There has already been historically a discussion when it comes to intersectionality for things like the fight for civil rights, the fight for suffrage, but it was not dominant, therefore it can still exist absent this dominance. This is a recent and modern idea when it should be the overriding interest when it comes to discourse and something that we should regulate and put the standard on. This is something that the opposition will have to defend and talk about. So let's be very clear then what is the dominance we're actually going to be regretting in this debate. It is the putting this in the idea of intersectionality as a priority issue and point of discourse. That if you are not going to be the most broadest and most specific about the information you're talking about, if you're not being informed about something that happens in a different state, an identity you did not know about, that means the discourse you bring is not meaningful, it's not worth it, and it's not pushing the movement forward, and you're likely to be punitively called out for it. You have to take into account every single angle, which means you have to take things like time, you have to take things like resources, you have to take things like information. Second, it is not just a point of discussion. This will be a point of discussion on our side regardless of or because of what we said earlier, but it's also on because of the dominance, you're likely to diminish other lenses that are likely to reject them in favor of intersectionality. It is like how progressives are some certain progressives are easily dismissed Kamala Harris during the recent US elections for presidency because she did not give a concrete statement for Palestinian genocide. This is where we're likely to split votes. This is where we're likely to split individuals. It is also the derailing of more immediate benefits, policies, and campaigns in the discourse and exchanging for the finding of the most intersectional issues. This is where you're more likely to trade off things like abortion, trade off things like widespread kinds of discrimination in favor of trying to find that intersectionality. It comes from these progressive blocks and it comes at the cost for its other issues. Let's be clear with what we defend then. We talk about that intersectionality is, like I said, still going to be a consideration, but it's not going to weigh any heavier or be any dominant when we're talking about the other kinds of issues that exist within movements and within the progressive bloc. There would be a bigger emphasis on those things that are urgent, those things that harm most people and can be easily passable and be easily digestible to the vast majority of individuals when it comes to these kinds of things. We can work towards intersectionality without its dominance through things like stepping stones. We think that there's a greater burden on opposition side. A greater burden for our, and especially the progressive blocs, to be cater to the larger majority of individuals and to be a lot more encompassing. I'll take you later. First key piece of argumentation: why you're likely to fracture the movement because of this very difficult to engage with discourse. We think that there are far too many considerations when trying to reach the standard of dominance in intersectionality that likely leads to things like paralysis. People are far too worried about being wrong and far too worried about not being inclusive enough. You have to be painfully accurate and do hours and hours of research to even get one single conversation started. Defending your position requires information, requires multiple amounts of standards and checking for a regular person to be even able to enter and engage with it in the first place. That means it is difficult to opt into this discourse and discussion, even if it includes you, because not everyone has the time to make this research and make that. Not everyone has the resource to want to invest into these things and interact with numerous resources and be exposed to other identities. But not everyone has the capacity to emphasize to this great degree of so much that it's not even being relatable to you. Second, it's likely to diminish other more urgent lenses that we actually need to talk about as a progressive bloc that is already in a state that is likely to be swaying to be more conservative by the day. That means you have to be aware of everything and fight on the broadest stances on opposition side. And every small failure is likely to lead to things like punitive callouts, saying that you are uninformed, and be able to have things like backlash towards you. This is where people are likely to be more critical and more feel a lot too extreme when it comes to the progressive movement. This is why Trump gained popularity, because people do not want to go through the work of emphasizing to every single individual's inspire and go for more policies that are just involving things like the economy, involving things that only directly involve them. Lastly, you get less meaningful discourse. We think this is where the pendulum swings a lot further, because policies and strategies either become far too general to want to try to include every single person that it's not likely to pass things like Congress, or this discourse even leaves things like TikTok. Second, it either becomes that or it becomes far too radical that people just feel like you're going to be far too extreme and only catering to the smallest kind of people and making them the forefront of your movement. The impacts then are clear. Firstly, it hastens the pendulum swing in favor of conservative views that are likely to seem a lot more palatable to the vast majority of instances and people in the state. Second, movements are more likely to actually split up because they do not feel or agree and resonate with this overtly dominance of intersectionality. But before that, I'll take a POI.
So just to be clear, given the setup you ran, you guys think intersectionality is the intersection of Zionism and not supporting Zionism?
I do not know what you're trying to ask me. So I'm going to continue with the rest of it. Next is that you're likely to get things like isolation of more centrist and more moderate individuals who feel like this discourse is way too heavy. You place an undue burden and alienate these individuals because they ultimately are overexerting their capacity to do things like being able to emphasize and exerting too much effort into these niche things. This is where you're likely to get activist fatigue. This is where you're likely to get less engagement, and this is where your discourse is likely to be way less meaningful. That's why the comparative is clear. We stop this fatigue. We focus on key issues, and this is where we're able to talk more discussion and draw more people in. And as it naturally progresses, that's when we become more intersectional. It is talking about making it easier for people to join this movement and side with progressives because we have policies that are easier to understand and at least get some margin of change. This is where we're likely to get things like become more intersectional of later on as we gain more and more approval and push against the pendulum to be a lot more progressive in the current present. So if you want to talk about where progressive discussions are actually meaningful and where you protect the vast majority of minorities, you have to side with side government.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to open the case of the opposition side, calling on the leader of opposition, here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay, great, thanks. Just give me a second to fix my notes. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proper discourse can only happen when we provide voices for the most vulnerable. It is only in opposition where dominance opens up the space. We think that government oversimplifies this at the expense of minorities. The first thing that I want to set up in this debate is as to what exactly we support. We would support the dominance of intersectionality insofar as it has led to a better world, that absent it would have led to worse conversations, less nuanced change, etc. I want to clarify two things in this debate. Firstly, this isn't just a debate about the truth value of whether or not intersectionality is good. It's just about its utility in discourse. What government had to defend on their side of the house was necessarily identities being treated as an umbrella and a lot of these voices being drowned out. I don't think that this was something that they're able to properly explain. But the second is just that we think intersectionality isn't exactly what they frame it to be, right? It isn't just discussions of the most minority individuals. It's also just including more nuance about the specific sectors that are already discussed. So for instance, if government says that the dominance of intersectionality has led to way too much sensitivity that paralyzes the movement as a whole, we think that on either side, necessarily movements want more sensitivity because that's what allows more representation for minorities have historically been locked out. That's the only way that you get change. On their side, movements are only movements with a name, but without the actual spirit of what exactly it is that they want. What then are both teams defending? We think that firstly on opposition, with the dominance of the narrative, we just have more voices for minorities to be heard. There are three reasons as to why this is exclusive on our side. The first is necessarily because movements need to be more pragmatic, right? Insofar as oftentimes, if they don't really have dominance and that leads these resources being directed towards a specific demographic, we think that oftentimes it means that these are people and these are perspectives that are going to be drowned out by bigger voices as a whole. But secondly, we also just think inherently that it's often only the most privileged who often have resources to discuss these issues. I mean that if we don't make a concerted effort to be able to do this, I think it's just something that doesn't really exist on gov. This means that at this point in time, government just has to defend a lot of these minority voices not being able to exist at all. But okay, fine. Even if they want to say there's an ability to get balance on their side, we think that the balance that they get is still bad for two reasons. That one, if the movement ends up being dominated by certain people, we think that it's likely that it's on their side where issues are likely to be less diverse. So for instance, women who wanted the vote in the first movement of feminism only push for white women to get that vote. If you end up putting the movement and not having that sort of diversity towards just one particular side, we think that it means that you're never able to get the vote for black women, and this is a group that is still significantly harmed. But secondly, we also just think that it's on their side where they significantly slow down the progress of the movement. Insofar as there are a lot of people who want to discuss multiple issues, if these are issues that are not put under that umbrella of identity being as important for that entire group, we think that oftentimes these are things that are minimized even if it's for the government's as a whole. Two arguments then. The first is on as to why social movements as a whole are just far more limited on government. We think historically movements have been used to amplify the voices of the marginalized. We think then the dominance is generally just led to more equitable movements along with ones that are just far stronger in terms of their numbers and advocacies. On government then, movements simply can't get this because internally they just don't have a lot more open conversations about what exactly they need to grow. This happens for three reasons. That one, it is at the point where you lock out a lot of perspectives outside of the lens of intersectionality that you just get a lot more myopic viewpoints. Insofar as certain demographics are likely to take over, so for example, white women within feminism as a whole, simply because that's how the numbers add up, we think that it means that the experience of feminism as framed to outsiders is only going to be pegged to these white women as opposed to representing other groups within this. But secondly, it's also just on the fact that that without intersectionality and without being able to discuss this in one go, oftentimes there's going to be a lot of fragmentation as to how these things affect you. So, for instance, if you're a black woman, you're not going to be able to discuss being a woman and being black at the same time. You're going to have to discuss this separately, which just means that movements as a whole often get divided as you choose what exactly it is that you prioritize. People internally aren't going to provide that same amount of strength as they would in ours, where they're able to consider both these things under a singular group. But thirdly, it's also just the fact that the lack of intersectionality has led to it not being treated as a major consideration by the movement. Insofar as there's probably a singular narrative that it's being pushed, that just means that there's a lot less of ability by the movement as a whole to really consider things outside this. On opposition, then, we think we're far better in three ways. That one, far more people are going to feel encouraged to share their viewpoint insofar as it's something that's termed under the movement as being just as important as the experiences of others. The second is that they can also find more ways to discuss this simultaneously and to discuss the ways that this ends up affecting them. But thirdly, it's also just the fact that more often than not, people are going to make more of a consideration before sharing exactly what their thoughts are and how it affects other people. If government argues sensitivity, we think that this is good because it just means the movement as a whole becomes more sensitive to what exactly it is that they need to improve. The conclusion is simple, right? We are able to get more fair movements, and this means that one, more minorities are able to get a say, but two, more people are going to feel as though this is somewhere that they belong, and this just makes the movement, and this allows the movement to get larger over time as well. Before I go on to the second argument, POI.
When we forget about the black solo poly hijabi woman amputee, the dominance tells the movement to lock out these individuals from the movement. How do you resolve this?
The dominance doesn't tell the individuals to these individuals to be locked out of the movement insofar as it's only the dominance that allows for them to be discussed at all. So for instance, even if there are some identities that are going to be deprioritized, we think that that's still good because these are at least things that are brought to the table at this point in time. Second argument then, why are movements more able to make an impact on side government? On side opposition. There's a lot of problems with what happens on government as to how they're able to make an impact, right? The first is that oftentimes a lot of their messaging is very easy to disregard insofar as it doesn't actually cover specific nuances. So for example, insofar as these experiences are going to be whitewashed in the way that they're said to others, oftentimes if it doesn't fit the personal experience of those who are listening to it, they're going to dismiss it because you don't immediately premise it with the fact that this might not be something that applies to all individuals. The second is that even if you don't discredit it, it just means that the singular message is more likely to be co-opted by elites. So for example, if you're pushing for for women in general to be recognized as opposed to discussing the individual nuances of what each woman might be going through and how a woman in poverty might be different from one who is rich, we think that this on-side government where the state as a whole is just going to say, oh, we're better for women without actually discussing the specific ways then that they're better for women across these different spectrums who might not necessarily overlap to the same extent. Thirdly, it's just on mixed messaging, right? Insofar as you're unable to represent that, insofar as you're unable to really explain the systematic issues and how they affect a lot of people, we don't think that they're able to fully bring this to the table. But fourthly, it's also just the fact that the movement as a whole is going to be seen as more elite, as way too elitist, meaning that a lot of people don't want to join. It is on opposition then with more nuance where you think we're able to send the message that just better benefits in institutions or individuals in terms of how they're able to just explain these things in a way that you are just in terms of how you are part of the system as well. For all these reasons and more, oppose.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to extend the case of the government side, calling on Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello. POIs via voice. Just raise it once and then I will take you. I will say when I'm ready to take you. Starting, I was okay, hold on. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. I want to be clear about where the dominance exists because we do not regret the concept of intersectionality as a whole. There was intersectionality during the 60s between the feminist and civil rights movement when they campaigned and mobilized hand in hand for the rights to their respective for the right to vote for their respective communities. This is a specific manifestation of intersectionality that we support in the counterfactual. One where different communities are able to choose to intersect at strategic points, but are not shamed when they choose to prioritize issues that are more proximate approximate to themselves when needed. The dominance of intersectionality is one that is modern and one that imposes a specific lens with which we are allowed to view and interact with progressive discourse. The dominance also assumes that any deviation from this lens is punished and the merits of that case is diminished, which is a problem because oftentimes the consequences of this discourse are people's actual lives. It is politicians being voted into office. It is policies that are created for people that are poor. In 2024, progressives campaigned against Kamala Harris under the banner of intersectionality, citing her support for the genocide in Palestine. Valid. But when Black and Brown Americans and the children of immigrants pleaded with voters for harm reduction to prevent the current violence that they are subject to right now in terms of deportation, in terms of anti-discrimination laws being rolled back, progressives told them that they were selfish, that they were short-sighted, that they were just as bad as Trump. This is what the dominance of intersectionality does, is that it attaches morality to your conformity. They say that people are more encouraged to share their viewpoints when we allow them to be intersectional. Again, they aren't, because of the fact that you have to consider so many different opinions, so many different options other than just your own lived experience as someone that is part of a minority, as someone that is already marginalized. That's how we get the voters fatigue that we explained from Kristen, where even people who are progressive refuse to engage in actual progressive discourse because they're scared that they'll get shamed for it. They're scared that if they share their experiences as a woman, they will be called elitist. If they share their experiences as, for example, a member of the LGBT community, it's not enough because apparently they're also racist. That's the first impact that we explain, is that you get a lot more fracturing within the movement, but you also alienate potential allies as well. They don't respond to this at all. Let's look at the opposition case. The first thing that they say is that movements are in the counterfactual, movements will be dominated by certain people that have privilege. The first thing I want to note is there's incentive for you as a progressive movement to avoid this problem, because if you exclude all the poor women and the Black women and the gay women from your cause as a feminist movement, you won't have enough people to actually get the change that you want. So you're not able to exclude a lot of people from your movement. You want to be able to tell them that we will also campaign for your rights as well. The rights that you want, we agree with them. We want you to have those things and we want you to be happy and safe and supported. And that's why you have incentive to include them, because you're already progressive. You're already not part of the systems that are in power. So it's easier for you to just have that intersectionality when it is strategic. But secondly, even if it is true that in the short term, movements are going to be slower and movements are going to get less change, why is it okay? Firstly, because a lot of the problems that people in marginalized communities experience are problems that have the same or similar solutions, right? A lot of the ways, for example, with which we're able to solve discrimination against certain communities are the same anti-discrimination laws that we can implement for others. And that's why, even if movements are slower, it's okay if you're actually able to get change, because the problem in opposition is the paralysis that you place people into when you force them to contend with all these different identities, when you weaponize these identities against them in order to try to force them to fight for the cause that you support. That won't work. We've seen it time and time again, and we see it in the status quo. The fact that so many people voted third party, or so many people do not outwardly support the Democratic Party because of the fact that they were afraid to get shamed for it, directly resulted in the election of a conservative president. It's directly resulting in the shift to conservatism in progressive countries right now. That is the real life effects of the dominance that opposition refuses to engage with. The third thing is that the third thing is on why policies are just better on our side, because they don't actually explain why the change that they get on their side is good, even if it's intersectional. What we explain is that, firstly, a lot of the policies that you get when you opt for a more intersectional view of things are policies that are generally more generalized.
POI.
For this is that, sorry, later. A lot of the policies that you get when you fight for intersectionality are policies that are often more generalized. The reason for this is that you can't advocate for it just takes a lot more time and a lot more effort to uniquely go into the specific nuances of what everyone is experiencing right now, right? And that results in policy makers that promise things like I am progressive under the progressive umbrella, but
the policies that are actually proposing are policies that don't actually create a lot of change and a lot of tangible change that people need right now. But the second way that this can go about is policies become much more radical. So because you can't just fight, for example, for the right to women, the right for women to get like equal wages, right? You have to also fight for the specific rights of like labor unions, etc., etc. That's how you get policies that are far more radical. And in these two instances, these are
Yun.
policies that are unlikely to pass through the Senate and the Congress. That's how change becomes much slower on opposition. Go.
Intersectionality is not identity politics. Why are movements more likely to fracture with intersectionality when we explain that it's at the point when people don't feel heard that they actually leave?
Guys, intersectionality is the dominance of intersectionality is forcing people to contend with the many different, maybe not just identities, but ideologies that exist, right? That's what intersectionality is. It's combining different groups of people and forcing people to discuss these different viewpoints. So that's why fracturing happens, right? We explained very clearly that one, not everyone is going to agree with the dominance of intersectionality because these are people that, again, are already marginalized, already experience these problems. If you're already if you're already poor, for example, why will you care about the issues of the LGBT community, getting a job to support yourself and to support your family? These are the things that, again, cause the very things like voter fatigue, etc., that we explain on our side. That's why movements are far weaker, and that's why the world's turning to shit. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to extend the case of the opposition side, calling on Deputy Leader of Opposition, you're here.
Hello, am I seen and heard?
Yes, you're loud and audible and also visible.
Thank you. Shout out to David Menches. Yes. Shout out to Shara who's also watching. She's very supportive, so I'm happy. Okay. What does the dominance of intersectionality look like? I think Gov hangs and relies on the 1960s civil rights movement, where we already explained that social movements need to evolve with the times and different conditions of different people. These conditions being increased access of information through things like the internet. This looks like the current amplified voices of different minorities. The reason intersectionality has to be the default or the dominant frame alongside other smaller frames of viewing the world is because you have this access to that information, but the tipping point is how do you analyze this information? What conclusions do you lead to? If you hear the story of a Black woman, do you simply say, okay, we just need to solve problems for all women and this Black woman will be fine? Or do you realize that the things that specifically Black women need require more specific adjustments and additions to your whole for women policy? This applies in a transmutative process to things like Indigenous women, to things like poor women, to things like trans women. These are things that are extremely important and require a dominance, or else, as Mimi explained, it will be pushed out through things like the dominant agenda, through things like liberal white feminism or identity politics. My question is, does it punish other perspectives? Let's analyze their central Kamala Harris example. The progressives did not lose her the election. It was the other way around of her failing to adjust and corroborate these other views when most of her support base in the first place was not going to change their mind on Kamala if Kamala was going to suddenly be pro-Palestine or even pro-ceasefire in that sense, right? But let's rebut this structurally. One, it does not punish other perspectives to the degree that they explain because there's a high threshold for punishing other views in regards and in relative to intersectionality in the first place. Why? Because it has a very vast consideration in of itself. If you're unsure about how intersectionality manifests at this point of the debate, it is not what they explain that you have to care about the minority of the minority of the minority of the minority or else you'll be punished. It is that you're considering different experiences, that yes, there may be a hierarchy, but this hierarchy is justified through the intensity and the depth of the harm that you experience. It is that the misogyny that you experience as a woman or a hate crime that you experience as a trans person cannot easily be as reconciled with if you do not have the money for criminal justice and lawyers, if you do not have the money for sanitary products as a woman. These are important considerations that require dominance because these things need to be in people's mind. Secondly, what are the outside views that they explain will be punished on their side? We think these are things such as greed capitalism, things like identity politics, things like hanging on liberalism for liberalism's sake without discussing things like progressivism. These are things that are important because if they want to explain and vaguely posture at punishing outside views, these outside views punish minorities in the sense that they become the dominant perspective. Take note, they do not fulfill their counterfactual on why other dominant perspectives won't just take this opportunity to like become a dominant perspective in the first place. Next, they explain that poor women will be poor women, for like taking their example, will be included anyway, as they say later. What they're describing when they're in regards to policies like that have to cater to poor women is intersectionality. If this is true and they like intersectionality and acknowledge its benefits, this is a game of extents then. If there are more poor women in the movement because more intersectionality means more of their voices are heard and more people understand them even if they're from the middle class or from LaSalle or Ateneo, that is better. Next, why is our side more impactful? This is to answer their burden push. One, there's nuance in the stances that we have, meaning it is harder to rebut by the right. Secondly, elites in that sense within and outside of the movement have to address different issues in order to be validated and recognized. Next, there are more specific and diverse explanations of situations, meaning that, and this is very important, right? Intersectionality is one of the easiest ways to acknowledge systemic ills. Why? Because if you explain your experience as a Black woman specifically, like hassle, right, in your life, that is when you explain things like redlining. That's when you explain things like the criminal justice system, because that's the only way that you can explain why your experience is different. So you can discuss these different things. Lastly, intersectionality means broad policy with various different compounding effects on people. If intersectionality means a wage increase is something that is good for both poor women and middle class women, we support it. The next thing that I want to call out is the exclusivity issue in government. They assume that we have no urgency. Problem, moderate discourse in of itself that they defend is less urgent because urgency comes from compounding risk of harm. For example, your immigrant neighbor being under risk by the ICE. We flip it therefore and deflate their exclusivity by explaining that they are more moderate, less urgent. Next, there's a pressure to be correct that exists on either side. The problem is you are punished for sharing your specific experiences on government because intersectionality is no longer the dominant form. Meaning that on our side, comparatively, it's okay to be pressured to be considerate because to be considerate, guys, is important and a central part of being progressive. If you are not considerate, you are not progressive. Secondly, on access to discourse, government assumes you do not relate to the majority of discourse on our side. No, intersectionality intersects with you, brother. Like the difference is a full-on set of experiences that you have. So you share your experiences and also have your own in the varying sets. Meaning, a bi and a lesbian woman both experience homophobia but experience biphobia and lesbophobia differently. But this allows for things like empathy and understanding. So, but even if you relate on the basis of God, it is learning about others extremely enticing for anyone like vast, like even a bit progressive. The conclusion of this is that it's untrue that you hyper-focus on the minority of the minority, we win access. Next is on fatigue. Tired on either side because you are counteracting a system that does not cater to you. The difference is that you both feel heard and you can understand each other more when it is the norm. A progressivism that is not tiring is not impactful. If you take them at their best, they are not impactful. Fatigue therefore comes with a lot of things like fulfillment in progressivism when you help people. So you weigh all this out. POI.
So you create your own problem, right? You say that elites have to do this, that people have to do this. That is exactly what creates the fatigue. You have to prove why people will opt in because that's the prerequisite to your entire case.
I just explained that you are tired by being progressive no matter what. You have to respond properly. Substantive, lastly. How does communication happen in progressive discourse and why does it need intersectionality as a dominant concept? This one I analyze the sender-receiver understanding, right? There are two tipping points to why discourse is good. One is that you have a shared framework of understanding the world. This is important for mutual understanding. Because if you explain things like the experience of Black women, a white feminist might not be able to understand this because they have a very vastly different way of understanding the world. The problem is that you have disillusioned receivers if white women take the helm of movements and they come off as hypocritical to the outside. The second tipping point is good and productive outcomes. This is important because if you want nuance, it is harder on their side when you're unsure about what to believe, when there's no dominant policy on their side, or if your ideas are have a risk of whitewash. You don't know what organizations to join. You don't know if your message is properly clear because there's not enough tangibility to what you're experiencing because intersectionality demands specificity. Movements demand specificity because this is a balancing act, right? You cannot simply have the voting rights for white women. You have to have it for Filipino women. You cannot simply have green capitalism. You have to have like mangrove planting. You have to have degrowth. These things are important and these things are not exclusive to their side.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to crystallize the case of the government side calling on government whip, you're here.
All right. Hi. I'm assuming I'm both audible and visible.
Yes, you're loud and clear and visible.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. There might be background noise, so let me know if it's too loud. We do not deny that people are complex, but the problem with the dominance is it emphasizes individuals' complexities and makes individuals way more responsible over a large set of identities that they have to be responsible for in the status quo. That is why discourse is bad, because you place undue burden to individuals to have to take responsibility out of so many various issues that individuals face. That is why discourse on their side is just way worse. The first question I want to dismantle is how the dominance actually manifests in the real world right now. Their claim is, on opposition, they probably won't be inflammatory to a certain degree because people will still want to consider differences and people still want to consider nuance because they want to forward their progressive agenda. The first thing I want to explain and disprove is why this is just untrue. The reason is people are different. People are different inherently, right? It's very difficult to understand the main lived experiences of someone who you did not grow up with, someone who was brought up like miles away from you, than, for example, your own personal experiences. But secondly, people do not want to feel uncomfortable that easily. For example, the discourse of feminism, the discourse of Black feminism, and the discourse of Philippine feminism is severely different. But more often than not, when you present it to the whites, they more often than not already feel uncomfortable with the idea of even talking about it. So what this demonstrates is that historically, there's always been an apprehension with addressing intersectionality precisely because we humans are very complex and we face situations very much differently. And the problem is that the likely scenario on their world is the dominance reinforces the idea that you have to think about every single identity, every single ideology that every single individual faces at that point in time. That means that since individuals already are naturally predisposed to not want to do that, the movement then, and the likely scenario is that the movement will be more stringent, the movement will be more inflammatory, the movement will be more strict about things like intersectionality, the movement will be more strict about, making sure that every single individual and every single lived experience is included in the discussion. So they can't just brush it off, right? Because the likely scenario is the feminist movement will sure want to prioritize generalist policies, but also at the same time has to also over prioritize the idea of intersectionality, that every single policy, for example, has to include every single identity that exists in status quo. So what they had to engage with is the form of dominance that more often than not discourages a lot of individuals from entering in discourse in the first place. Because you place a lot of standards that individuals have to follow within the discourse, you have to place a lot of standards that these individuals have to meet. Because if you don't, you're a bad activist. Or if you don't, you fail to fulfill your activist duties, or you fail to fulfill the duty that you have to do within those types of discourses. That is the problem that we explained from Kristen, that more often than not, before the discourse even happening, individuals are already discouraged in entering these spaces in the long run. So that is the comparative that they had to defend, because otherwise individuals find it difficult to understand these situations, therefore movements have to be more inflammatory to them. That ends the first discussion. So they had to defend that stringency, right? The second discussion then that I want to attack is on the question, does nuance actually matter in everything, over everything else, such that you have to prioritize this as the movement? The first thing I want to explain is the harms that we demonstrate at first speaker that until now is not engaged with. What we specifically demonstrate is that the nuances that a lot of individuals face at this point in time is severely different from the lived experiences of other individuals, which means that the barrier to entry this discourse on their world, since it's dominant, is obviously way harder, because you have to understand way more complex things. You have to understand the history of Black Black women versus the history of, feminism as a whole, precisely because there's an emphasis on that dominance in themselves. And the problem with this is when you want to amass greater discourse, when you want to amass actual meaningful discourse that includes like way more individuals outside your political spectrum or way more individuals that you're trying to amass into your political movement, that becomes harder on their world because there's such an emphasis of nuance that when people make mistakes or when people make unnuanced claims that are just general, that is where you lock individuals out. That is where you become way more stringent to them, and that is where more often than not nuance is like just weaponized even more. But even if you believe that nuance is actually good, opposition never proves as to why the type of nuanced conversations is one that's actually meaningful. What we demonstrate is that because the mental bandwidth for an individual to understand various complex political thought is very much limited, the problem is the nuanced discussions that exist on their world are probably going to either be one, misinterpreted, or two, way too radical for the average individual to understand, or three, just disregarded as a whole precisely because the conservative bloc doesn't care about these issues because they're way too specific for the average reasonable person to understand. So that is where you get fatigue. But secondly, that is also where you get unmeaningful discussions about these individuals. So even if there is discussion, opposition just never proves as to why that discussion is one that's meaningful or one that actively and truly represents these individuals. Like, look at status quo, guys. We make fun of the black solo hijabi poly amputee precisely because that idea of intersectionality is one that is unduly placed on the responsibility of every single individual to have to learn and to have to fight for at their everyday individuals. On the comparative, as we sufficiently demonstrate, at least individuals are less pressured and at least less fatigued to deal with these circumstances. So that ends the second discussion, right? Nuance at this point in time, especially when forwarding discourse, doesn't matter enough such that they have to be over prioritized. Like, we agree it still matters, right? But it does not justify over prioritizing it over other issues. So what lens then should we view discourse? But before that, TYs, go.
Explain that the lens that you have to view discourse with needs to be consistent, or else people will view the world in vastly different ways and you'll never agree on anything.
Okay, yeah, that deals with the comparative. Let's explain why the focus on urgency and proximity within issues have to be prioritized over intersectionality. The first thing I'd like to note is just that makes more sense, right? The ways in which intersectionality is now going to be injected in our discussions is when it's actually necessary. So we point to trends, for example, in the 60s, where the Black movement and the feminist movement actually collaborated to fight for their own individual rights of suffrage. We point to other examples where identities actually collaborate with each other in order for them to get meaningful change. That is the type of intersectionality that we ought to defend and we can proudly defend. But the problem on their world is because there's an overarching idea and pressure that everything has to be intersectional, more often than not, it does not make sense for the average reasonable person to understand all of these claims and understand all of these things from the get-go. The second is just the fact that it's easier to digest. So even in the instance where it is simple and principally consistent and we trade off the fact that some minorities might not get their voices heard, the problem on their world is they do not explain how individuals are going to opt in. At least on our side, the rate of opt-in probably increases more when the types of conversations and the types of discourse is easier to digest on their side and way more urgent and proximate such that people actually care. But the third is just the fact that people are probably going to want to engage more precisely because the issues are more proximate to them, because they see these lived experiences and because they see all of these things to be way closer to them. So what the slip speech does is clear up three things. The first is that opposition had to defend a world in which people are way more stringent and way more inflammatory to individuals when they fail their activist duties. The second is on the comparative, why nuance generally isn't supposed to be the most important value that discourse has to prioritize, because more often than not, it backfires to the movement. But finally, on the comparative, it's better to prioritize things that are more urgent and things that are more proximate to you, because that's where you get better discussions.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to crystallize the case of the opposition side, calling on opposition whip, here.
Hello, is this audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible and very visible.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll just fulfill some shout out requests. Sorry. Shout out to Monty, Iggy, Kyle, David. Thank you to my teammates for this is our first prep comp, by the way, for PIDC. And yeah, shout out to Kristen because she gave me one. And then I guess shout out to my girlfriend for making me less emotionally dependent on this sport, so I can now enjoy the game for what it is. This is also my first grand final in college, so yeah. Hooray. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Gov wants to adjust based on time, context, and the needs of people. So they seem to care about proximity and urgency. It does awfully sound like they want to get the intersection of different people's ideologies and backgrounds so that they can have a nuanced strategy. That does sound quite interesting. So this is where I really want to undo the semantic trick that Gov has been pulling throughout this entire debate. Because intersectionality wasn't this strawman caricature of an activist going on TikTok and spamming, but guys, what about Palestine like everywhere? If anything, it is the opposite. It is the people who understand that people can't fully commit to supporting Palestine because they might get fired, can't commit to attending rallies all the time because they have to work 3 jobs. If anything, people who understand intersectionality are the only people who are actually able to approach that with a nuanced lens. So this is the undoing of the semantic trick, right? Because it wasn't about people like because just because you see that the system affects people differently doesn't automatically mean that people are going to take it as an attack on themselves. It isn't you telling people that, hey, you should not talk about your problems because other people have bigger problems. No, it is understanding that people have different problems, right? Literally, that's what intersection in intersectionality is. And this is important because this undoes the biggest assumption that underpins all of their claims, that it was going to be a burden to people, that they're going to step on eggshells, that they're going to be fatigued and just not participate in the movement as a whole. Because, guys, objectively, yes, it is true that there is a difference between a poor person from Luzon and a poor person from Mindanao. But that doesn't mean that we tell the poor person from Luzon to be quiet, right? So overall, what this like entire clarification just does is that it wasn't about making people feel less about their struggles. It was just telling people that they have different struggles. And that's why we are already ahead just by debating closer to reality than they are. The first issue then that I want to tackle is just a defense of why it has to be dominant. I want to note that this was about what progressive discourse sounded like, not just discourse in general, which is another like minus points on their lack of nuance. But I want to note what this means is that progressives have always assumed a role to be more extreme than the norm. This is what I told you from Elle and Mimi. The reason why that's important is because that's where you're able to incubate certain ideas, where you're able to bring people into discussions which otherwise they wouldn't have been able to enter to because they don't have the money or because they don't have the time, right? That's where people understand, like that's where white feminists understand that there are certain parts of the world pala that don't have clear access to sanitary products yet. A concept that would have been completely unknowns to them if it wasn't for intersectionality. But secondly, as we pointed out, this is the reason why you're able to deal with rich-centric voices. And this is important because this also flips the underpinning claim that they have on elitism. We explained that absent the dominance, you would have interpeople, like you would have rich people just taking over in terms of their voices. It was because you are not, because there is the people that have the most money, the most time to dedicate to the movement. And this is important because we're not saying that these people don't mean well. We're saying that these people might not be aware of certain experiences and we're not punishing them for not knowing. If anything, you are punishing them far more under their side of the house because they only realize that they're not aware of these things later on, which is precisely why the discussions that you have within progressive circles has to be inherently intersectional so that people understand what they can do to help, what well-meaning privileged people can do to help. And the weighing here is very important because maybe at best, yes, you can, create alliances when it is necessary, but it wasn't just about different movements coming together. Intersectionality wasn't just about that. It was about the quality of the discussions you have inside each specific movement. It wasn't about taking as many oppression points as possible, which is, by the way, the really disgusting strawman that we heard from the other side. It was that you acknowledge that the people with different disadvantages within each movement have different needs and different wants, right? This is important because this was the prerequisite to all other things like mobilization, like having discussions with people, because this informs how the movement moves forward and gives them a core strategy. On their side, this core strategy is precisely the kind that you get coming from their side, where you are where you are a single issue voter and you only push on one certain thing, and it makes it far worse. But I understand that their main claim here is really on palatability, so I will also be undoing that next. So this is the second issue on palatability. They say that people will be too scared to speak up because people will be angry at them for not knowing enough. Like, I want to know, this again leans on the really weird strawman on just TikTok activism where people just yell all the time.
if anything, I will flip this. It is worse under their side because the reason why these people are mad is because they don't understand why certain people might have different ideologies. Some people don't understand, for example, that poor people have less access to education, which might mean that they are less exposed to progressive ideologies. And this is important because that's where people are more likely to understand why people think in certain ways, even if it is in disagreement with them. So if anything, intersectionality is the one that accounts for the fact that people in the Rust Belt don't care about environmentalism or don't care about identity politics or don't care about whatever thing interests the Democratic Party in that specific moment. Because only our side understands that these people have more important priorities, and that's why we also tackle fatigue. Before I continue on, go ahead.
So this is kind of contradictory, right? You say that it's not so many issues that people will feel fatigue, but you also say that this is how we educate people on issues that are not proximate to them. If it's not proximate to them, why will they not be fatigued?
Poverty is proximate to a Rust Belt worker. That's what we're saying. On your side of the house, you tell them, well, you have to care about environmentalism, full stop. The difference on our side is that you care about environmentalism and you give the intersectionality of them being poor. So you help them understand how the green transition does not necessarily negative affect or how they can mitigate the harms of the green transition on poor Rust Belt workers. Guys, being poor is also a minority trait, and that means that you're also considering the capacities of these people in intersectionality. So at the end of this, why is this quite important? Because obviously, this completes the flip that we say. It is far more unpalatable under their side because it is dominated by rich discourse by rich people that have never had to work a hard day in their lives, right? Only intersectionality allows you to factor in the fact that some people don't have the same amount of resources to advocate for certain things, that some people require more radical action because they live in places that are inaccessible to those kinds of things. And this is important because they're able to make the more. The last thing that I want to talk about, so this is the last issue, is just how we protect people inside the movement. Because regardless of whether or not you're able to actually create change, what we demonstrated coming from L was that we made people in the movement feel heard. We made people who are the people cared about by these minority movements to feel safe. And if neither team is able to resolve the clash on us creating change, then what is more important is that we actually feel a certainty that these people will feel safe and feel listened to. For all of those reasons, negate.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to wrap up the one half of this round, calling on the opposition reply, here.
Hello. Shara, your cam is on. Off mo yung cam mo. Anyway, okay. If my mom was born in Iloilo and my dad was born in NCR and Hugh's parents were born in Mindanao and everyone's parents were born in different places, surely all of these different experiences intersect. This is why the intersectionality has been dominant, because we explained down the bench it is the thing that most people simply understand. Government only wins this debate with such a thin understanding of intersectionality. If you believe what they say, that intersectionality simply means you have to think about everything everywhere all at once all the time and walk on eggshells, there's simply no debate because that is such a horrible enchaining ideology. This ignores the eye test of reality that people aren't in chains and completely dying. Take note, their examples are on a very niche Twitter meme. When if you walk outside, people are like, oh yeah, your experience as an indigenous person is different. And that is why it has to be dominant, because people default to it, and that's good. We explain that intersectionality is expansionary and inclusive in that sense. So don't believe their framing, that it aims to relate to you and also to create empathy with others. I don't get why they don't like things like empathy. Next, if you have to believe that it is not as, so because of that, you have to believe it's not as extreme. People are pressured on our side. Yes, they are pressured to be considerate, but it is about reaching the threshold of being actually progressive. There is no use, walang saysay ang progressive discourse if people are not considerate of different intersecting experiences. That like that takes them out. But if you believe that people getting tired is enough for a movement to fail, you skipped a lot of logical steps if you believe that as a panel. If this is such a burden on people, I'm going to reiterate the weighing that we explained on the bench, right? We explained that the burden of being unheard, of being silenced, of being unnuanced, of your experiences not being mentioned at all or barely being mentioned in your circles is way worse than the simple task and the simple undercoming of providing yourself with compassion and trying to practice the idea of empathy. They explain that this is such a fatiguing concept with the only explanation as to why being because you have to understand people that is like it makes you fatigued. That is the same logic that conservatives use because conservatives trying to understand other people is a very big task. These are progressives we are talking about. These are people on the bench we are talking about. Conservatives don't give a shit either way. Next, note how all of their justifications in their positive case just depends on a lesser extent of intersectionality. Urgency, as I explained in my depth speech, comes from understanding who is the most harmed in the first place. You cannot have an urgency for a broad 1,200 like salary raise. You have to explain that informal workers exist and are like 2 times to 4 times as harmed. Next, proximity comes from how affected you are on the basis of identity and things like location. So if Hugh was born in Mindanao, he's obviously affected more. That's intersectionality. Next, if you're unsure about everything then that I just explained, it's important that there's a dominant concept that is as broad as intersectionality that exists. So if you buy a lot of their analysis and intersectionality excludes like 2% of people who want to do identity politics and are like, what about me who wants to buy like a paper straw or whatever? We can agree and we can actually talk about things on the same premises and the same understanding of the world. And that's why my extension was so important. It is that you have the same framing and basis for all of your analysis and all of the things you want to explain to people to come to life. This is why we agree on the same premises in debate, or else judges will have a hard time. This is why in real life, when you step outside, people agree that Black people are hurt more than white people. People agree that Asian people have had a specific experience with immigration into the US only being allowed in the 1960s. So this means it's more important for movements, and the conclusion is we're better. Lastly, what replaces intersectionality on their side? Because we already proved from Hugh that it's not urgency and proximity that replaces them, because that's intersectionality. We explained that it gets replaced by white feminism, green capitalism at worst, and identity politics at best, because these movements defer to the richest donor and the loudest voices. The dominance of intersectionality avoids that harm, which is why you have to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. In order to finally wrap up this round, calling on the government reply, here.
Hello. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Tama na, Angela. Sorry. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. Opposition refuses to engage with our comparative. What we explain is that intersection may still exist on our side, but in circumstances that are strategic for the two movements opting into them. And we give many real-world and historical examples of this, which they brush off and say, well, that was a long time ago, or that's not actually the debate. We ask them very reasonably, how does dominance occur if it's not punitive? Because they prove quite well why it has to be dominant, why people don't want to engage with intersectionality because it's difficult, because it's not proximate, because they have no incentive to. And what we explain is that if these reasons are true, the dominance must be forceful and they must be imposed. Listen to their language. Now, quote-unquote elites, quote-unquote, have to address different perspectives. Half of their case is contradictory. They say that they want to educate people about issues that, through circumstance, they may not have the education to be able to understand and to be able to be aware of. But also, that even though these issues are not proximate to them, they will not in fact create voter fatigue and make people not want to engage with the movement. So what is it? Are you educating people about people in the Rust Belt about things like climate change that they have to care about because they're poor, or are you educating them about issues on wages and issues on labor that are actually proximate to them, that they don't have to, that the dominance of intersectionality does not have to impose onto them? They also say that people
people are encouraged to share their viewpoints. How, right? If the dominance of intersectionality means that you have to care about other issues, they say that you don't. That's the entire debate, guys. You can't just contradict your frame at every speaker when it's convenient to you. So half of their case is contradictory, the other half is unengaging, because these are precisely the kinds of conditions that create the voter fatigue that we explain quite simply. Again, their only response is, well, this is good. This is something that people ought to do because you have to care about other people and is empathetic. Guys, yeah, we want people to care about other people. But if the result is them not opting into progressive discussion, them not opting into this discourse in the first place, that makes them more empathetic, even if it's slower, then that's obviously a harm. They say that, well, conservatives aren't affected by the debate anyway because they're not going to opt in anyway. This debate is not about the conservatives. This debate is about progressives that you alienate, that are part of marginalized communities that now feel as if they don't have a safe space with which to share their own lived experiences. This is about centrists that want to get into progressive discourse but feel as if they don't have the right to because they're not educated on these many spectrums of ideas. They say, well, it's not actually that difficult because guys, we can recognize that black people have it harder than Asian people, and that's good. Again, right, you have to be aware of of the ways that these different identities and these different experiences intersect, the dynamics between them, what made them happen. Those are all very complicated for the average reasonable voter to understand. And like we explained, you are imposing too high of a burden for them, even at the entry point of progressive discussion. We're not talking about progressives that are already in the movement, that are already open to discussing these things. We are talking about people at the entry point of progressivism that choose to opt out of it because of the fact that they don't feel as if they have a say, because of the fact that they don't feel as if they ought to be here. The reason why this is important is because opt-in is the prerequisite to everything that opposition explains. Things like change, things like progress. The prerequisite to all of these things is having more and more people be more progressive, more and more people opting into these movements. These things don't happen, and that's why change happens far less, because of the fact that people are less likely to opt in, people are less likely to engage. And in fact, even if you don't buy the backlash case on government, we still have the paralysis that we explain you impose onto voters when there are so many issues that they have to care about. Thanks.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, and that about wraps up the round. Congratulations, and thank you for that wonderful and engaging round. You may now cross the house. And me and my panels, I think we can head over to room 1, Angat the Lips, if that's all right. So yeah, congrats.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cross the house.
Sorry,
Cross
can
the
I
house.
say, Angela does not represent the values